Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Hi, AI Council Code listeners. Earlier this year, we recorded a two-part interview with Joe Cahill, an attorney in our Washington, D.C. office, on the draft legislation for the EU AI Act. Since our recording, the EU AI Act has passed in March 2024. And while my discussion with Joe considered the draft legislation, most of our discussion is still applicable, focusing on the legal framework and technical documentation required under the Act. Enjoy the discussion and stay tuned for more episodes. Welcome to AI Council Code. The AI Council Code is here to keep you up to date on all AI legal issues arising in the modern business frontier. I'm Maggie Welsh. I'm a partner at Baker Botts, and I co-chair the AI practice team. On our last episode of AI Council Code, we were joined by Joe Cahill, an attorney in our Washington, D.C. office, to discuss the EU AI Act. Joe provided the relevant regulatory landscape, and today we're going to be talking about ways for companies and in-house counsel to think about collecting and preparing technical documentation related to their AI systems in light of the EU AI Act. Joe, welcome back. Thanks for joining us on our podcast.
Of course, happy to be here.
Why don't you first introduce yourself for listeners that are just joining us for the first time today?
Yeah, Joe Cahill, as Maggie said, an associate in the DC office. I deal with patent litigation most of the day, but I have a strong interest in artificial intelligence as well. Technical background from undergrad engineering background, and I carried an AI interest all the way through law school and still tinker here and there. As AI became the new hot thing in the world, I welcomed it with open arms, and now there's so many interesting legal complications that we'll discuss on this podcast. So that's my background, that's my interest, and let's get into it.
So how should companies start to think about collecting and preparing documents for the EU AI Act? I mean, where does a company even start?
Boy, so you're going to want to start by first looking at this draft language in the EU AI Act. So we don't have that passed yet. We talked about that in part one. But you're going to want to look at taking an audit of what technologies you have internally and thinking about how the technologies that we have are going to apply to what is now draft language. Thinking, yes, this is within the framework, and I got to develop processes internally to make sure I am documenting what is in compliance, what might be out of compliance, and having a robust system to figure all that out as the act comes into force.
So you mentioned the framework of the EU AI Act. Can you break that down for listeners a little bit? What does that mean? How do you see the framework providing listeners with helpful guidance when they're collecting their technical information and documentation?
Yeah, so there are Articles 10 through 12 within the EU AI Act that mandate technical documentation. But when I review those, I see it broken down into three buckets. The buckets are what resources you have, what incentives are related to these AI systems, and what the outcomes are of utilizing these AI systems. So it's a bit of an abstraction out of what the actual language requires. What we talk about today isn't going to guarantee you're in compliance of the EU AI Act, but it'll start to give you the tools for thinking about how do I start to put a process in place and what are some heuristics for thinking about what I need to be doing to prepare as best I can.
Great, that's really helpful. So to think about resources, incentives, and outcomes and start thinking about your systems that way.
Exactly. And I think this will interface well with your engineering teams because this is how folks sometimes think about building these systems themselves. So having a technical documentation process that mirrors that may be one of the easier things to put together within your company.
So what is mandated from those articles 10 through 12 that you mentioned in the EU AI Act?
So the documentation you're required to have on file is going to detail the AI systems within an organization that are compliant with the EU AI Act. And it's important to note that Articles 10 through 12 deal with what are called high-risk AI systems. We discussed that a bit in part one of this podcast, but we can go back over the definitions so that we understand what we're talking about for these articles. And the high-risk systems are a set of AI systems that can create harmful risk for people's safety or fundamental rights. An AI system will always be considered high risk if it performs the profiling of people. The definition will be provided as well as methodology of identifying these high-risk systems in the finalized text. But for now, we just have some use cases and more general understanding of what's coming.
Okay, great. I think that's really helpful when we're talking about this documentation mandated in Articles 10 through 12. It's really just for those high risk use systems, so not the low risk that we were talking about in part one.
Yes. So when you do this audit of what you have internally, you're going to want to look at your AI systems with that in mind. Am I going to be within this bucket where I have to provide this technical documentation? If no, then you're fine. Don't have to worry about it. But if yes, we have to get into how to think about putting processes in place.
Great. And so you mentioned resources, incentives, and outcomes. What do you mean by resources?
So resources are arguably the most important, but these are going to include your data, your models, the memory you use, the computers you use. If you were a chef, it would be the ingredient list in your kitchen supplies. You're going to want to understand the architecture of the AI systems, design specifications, the algorithms that are involved, and the data structures utilized within these systems, as well as the data that you're utilizing to train your system and the data that you're providing as an input to get the system operating. So you're really wanting to focus on this portion because this is the lifeblood of how these AI systems operate. And it's important to get that first part correct and make sure everything's documented in that space of your resources and data. This is where you're going to want to make sure you're talking to all the relevant personnel because sometimes you may be surprised about where some of the stuff is coming. And you want to make sure you have all that fully understood and documented to make sure that we're getting within the realm of making this manageable and potentially compliant with the EU AI Act.
So the second bucket that you mentioned was incentives. So what do you mean by incentives and what documentation would that include?
So incentives are what we're trying to do with the resources that we already discussed. It's going to be how we define what the objective of the AI system is. So to go back to the chef analogy, this is going to be your recipe. Knowing how the resources are utilized and for what purpose is an important aspect of collecting technical documentation that describes the AI systems within your company. So when we're talking about incentives, I can give you a bit of an example of what an AI system would look like that may have differing incentives. You could have a classification system and it just says, this is a dog or not a dog. That's all I do. It's binary. It's 1 or 0. Yes, no. Or you could have something like a large language model, which is a type of foundational model. And what it's doing there is it's running a bunch of statistics and trying to predict what the next word might be in a chain of words. In that case, it's incentivized to predict a word, whereas in the first case, it's just incentivized to tell you dog or not dog. That's going to be an example of what are we trying to do with this system? What is the incentive? I want to make sure I fully understand that and have that documented within my technical documentation.
I see. So what the objective of the AI system is, what its use case would be for, and really making sure that's well documented.
Yep. What are we doing with those resources? What is the outcome we're trying to seek and making sure we understand that?
Great. And the last one you mentioned was outcomes. So what do you mean by outcomes and what do we need to be looking at there?
So outcomes are the result of running AI systems. If you give it this incentive, what is actually happening at the tail end of running this AI system? You're going to want to understand the types of outcomes you're getting, how often it's producing suitable results, in what format, who's using it, who's going to be interacting with these outcomes. This whole operation of the AI system is relevant to document. And this may look like keeping logs. So it may look like this input came in as the operation, this output was produced, and making sure you're logging all of those things to have a full view of what the outcomes are of your system. So to stick with the chef analogy, this is going to be your dish. So what did you make? What's it taste like? How did you plate it? It's going to be the end result of taking your resources, looking at an objective and then executing and having your dish in front of you.
Great. And I appreciate the chef analogy. I think it's helpful for everyone listening. So we got resources, incentives, and outcomes. I think that's a helpful way for people to look at how to start pulling the technical documentation that they need for the EU AI Act.
Yep, that's right.
There are a lot of different components with AI. So what does a company do if they don't know all the components of AI that a system is even using? How can they start tracking down these three different buckets that you mentioned?
So you're going to want to go to that technical team internally first. These folks should be able to tell you how these things are built. They should be able to understand what tools are being utilized to create these AI systems. And I'm sure the way things are built, you're going to have some third parties in there too. So you're going to need to go to those third parties and make sure you're getting that appropriate information from them as well. This may come in your agreement with them or may come separate. Luckily for you, if you're doing this robust process internally, you could present to these third party vendors, hey, this is what we need. This is the information that we seek. This is what we collect. This is where we see you fitting in our system. Provide it to us, or we're going to need to have a longer discussion about what exactly is happening here. So you're not going to be absolved of liability just because somebody else is providing you the AI system. You've got to take responsibility and really hunt down some of these technical details.
Great. Any other considerations that companies should be thinking about in terms of their technical documentation?
Yes. So this may not be a static thing. This may not be something you do once and then you've documented everything about an AI system and you're set. The nature of technology is it changes and new products are introduced. You want to make sure that if you're making changes to these AI systems, you note that as well, when they're made and what has changed. And having this living process of making sure all the documentation is collected as new iterations are released. That's another key component for sure, as you look about how to make these processes.
So all that you're talking about, Joe, it does sound like a lot of work and a lot of additional resources that a company might need to put into complying with the EU AI Act. What do you say to a company that just wants to wait a couple of years to see how it plays out?
You may, and if you don't have a big technical production, you may have the luxury of doing so and not really having any risk. But I do think it's prudent to be really thinking through early on what types of processes are going to put in place if you're falling in that high risk AI bucket. And there's value to this. So first and foremost, as we're discussing, complying with the law. And nobody wants to be breaking the law. That comes with a whole host of issues. So at the very foundational level, compliance is important. But also the regulatory environment is changing or it's set to continue to change as we go forward. So having a process ready to go once these laws come online means that you'll probably be a bit more resilient to new laws coming online in the future or laws changing or interpretations coming out. I mean, Maggie, you and I know as well as anybody that sometimes the language is a little gray and we kind of understand what the regulation is, but it might take a court case or something else happening to really understand what that means. And having that dynamic ability to take your process and adjust it is going to be really important. And then third, you and I are both intellectual property attorneys. There is a component with some of these legal trends where documentation of human involvement is a key aspect in ensuring that you get intellectual property protection, both for inventing things in the patent context or for getting a work protected in the copyright context. If you have a lot of documentation about the processes of building these AI systems and what goes into them, presumably you're also going to be able to demonstrate the human involvement required to produce the things that these AI systems produce, and you'll be able to get that protection.
Great. Yeah, that's an area we're looking at helping get that IP protection in the future.
Yeah, of course. And that's one of those spaces that we're getting more breadcrumbs, but things could even change a bit there too. So the regulatory landscape is shifting.
Thank you, Joe, for providing so many insights today. Any last words or final comments for our listeners?
I would say it's going to seem overwhelming, especially if you're a technical company. Just start with basics, figure out what you have, and then go from there. Keeping things simple and thinking higher risk, there's more things I have to consider, is a good first heuristic. And then develop the right processes. It's not a one and done. You want to make sure that we're designing a process here. So focus on those things, start chipping away. I'm sure that you'll be fine.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for your practical insights. Thank you to all of our listeners for listening to the AI Council Code. We're so glad that you joined us today, and stay tuned for additional podcasts and more insights on AI legal issues.
Thank you for listening to this BakerBots podcast. BakerBots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on BakerBots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by BakerBots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.